Robin Lawrence never imagined that a quiet November night in her peaceful Fairfax home would mark the beginning of a mystery that would take nearly 3 decades to solve. What started as an ordinary evening turned into a chilling crime that baffled detectives, silenced a neighborhood, and buried secrets deep beneath time until one forgotten piece of evidence finally brought her killer into the light. The neighborhood of Fairfax, Virginia, was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Rows of quiet houses lined the tree-shaded streets, and everyone knew each other by name. But on a chilly evening in November 1996, that sense of comfort was shattered forever. Robin Lawrence, a 37-year-old graphic designer and mother, lived alone while her husband worked out of town. She was known for her calm nature and reliability. That evening, she didn't show up to dinner with a friend, didn't return calls, and didn't answer the door when a neighbor checked in. Her porch light stayed on through the night, and her dog barked endlessly, a small warning that something inside the house wasn't right. The next morning, her coworker grew uneasy when Robin didn't arrive at the office. Robin was never late, never absent without notice. By noon, the coworker drove to her house, expecting to find her sick or resting. Instead, she found a scene that would scar her memory. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was still, with a faint metallic smell that filled the kitchen. Robin was found on the floor, motionless, her life brutally taken. The home was undisturbed, no broken windows, no ransacked rooms. It was clear that whoever had entered had been welcomed or had known exactly how to get in. When police arrived, they immediately noticed the precision of the scene. Nothing was stolen. Her purse sat on the counter, her jewelry untouched, and even her car keys were neatly placed by the door. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was deliberate, controlled, and deeply personal. Detectives photographed every inch of the house, searching for fingerprints, footprints, or any sign of struggle. There were faint marks on her wrist, suggesting she had been restrained, but the restraint was removed with care. Whoever did this had taken their time and made sure to leave as little evidence as possible. The neighborhood was thrown into panic. Residents who had never locked their doors started double-bolting them. Parents kept children indoors. The local news reported the case with urgency, describing Robin's murder as methodical and emotionless. But as days turned into weeks and no arrests were made, fear turned into frustration. People began to whisper theories, suspecting everyone from delivery drivers to close friends. Yet the truth remained buried beneath silence. In one night, the town had lost not only a kind woman, but also its sense of safety, and what began as a quiet evening in November became the start of one of Fairfax's darkest mysteries. Detectives began their work by retracing every step of Robin Lawrence's final days. Her phone records showed several unanswered calls in the hours before her death, but nothing unusual enough to raise alarms. Friends and coworkers described her as focused, responsible, and soft-spoken, someone who avoided confrontation and lived a simple, predictable life. There were no signs of secret affairs, debts, or feuds. Yet, somewhere beneath that quiet surface, something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators started interviewing neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard anything that night. One mentioned a dark sedan parked across the street a few days earlier, engine running, lights off. Another recalled hearing the faint sound of a door closing around 9 p.m., but no one thought much of it at the time. Forensic teams combed through the house, gathering every possible clue. They found partial fingerprints on the kitchen counter and a faint boot print near the doorway, but neither matched anyone in the police database. Small fibers found on the victim's clothing suggested contact with work materials, possibly from construction gloves or tools. Detectives checked local contractors, delivery services, and maintenance workers, but all leads came up empty. A former boyfriend was briefly considered a suspect, but he had an alibi supported by surveillance footage. Robin's husband, away on business in another state, was ruled out quickly. The lack of motive puzzled everyone. Nothing was taken, and there were no signs of forced entry, which meant Robin likely knew her killer or trusted them enough to let them inside. Investigators believe she may have been surprised, perhaps attacked suddenly during a casual visit. The controlled nature of the scene suggested the killer had planned it carefully, leaving as little behind as possible. Weeks turned into months. The once bustling investigation slowed down as new crimes demanded attention. Evidence was stored, reports filed, and theories abandoned. The community that had once been shaken began to move on, though whispers of Robin's murder lingered for years. Occasionally, detectives would reopen the file, hoping fresh eyes might find something missed. But technology in the late 1990s offered few breakthroughs. By the time the case was officially declared cold, Robin Lawrence's name had become another unsolved headline in the archives, a reminder of a killer who had vanished without a trace. And a mystery frozen in time, waiting for the day when truth would finally surface. More than 2 decades later, the file marked Lawrence, Robin 1996 gathered dust in the evidence room of the Fairfax County Police Department. It was 2020 when Detective Carla Jensen, newly assigned to the cold case unit, began reviewing forgotten cases for potential DNA breakthroughs. The Lawrence file stood out immediately. The details were chilling, the investigation thorough, yet something about it felt unfinished. The physical evidence list mentioned several sealed items never retested with modern technology, including a small strip of adhesive tape recovered from the victim's wrist. At the time, it had been preserved but overlooked due to the limitations of 1990 seconds forensics. Jensen decided to send the tape to the lab for a full DNA extraction using advanced touch DNA methods. Weeks later, results arrived. There was a partial genetic profile belonging to an unknown male. Though incomplete, it was enough to upload into a national genealogical database that used familial DNA to identify potential relatives. The system flagged a distant match linked to a family living just a few miles from where Robin's home once stood. The discovery reignited hope that the mystery could finally be solved. Detective Jensen traced the family tree backward, identifying several male relatives before narrowing it down to one man who fit the profile both geographically and historically. His name was Matthew Cross, a local handyman who had worked in the Fairfax area during the 1990s. According to employment records, he had been part of a small renovation crew operating only a few houses away from Robin's home in the weeks leading up to her death. Digging deeper, Jensen found Cross's criminal history. He had been arrested twice in the early 2000s for harassment and trespassing but had never served significant jail time. He had no known connection to Robin on record, but something about his timeline aligned too closely to ignore. She requested archived employment rosters from his former company and found his signature on a job order dated the same week Robin was killed. The evidence was still circumstantial, but it gave the investigation direction for the first time in decades. With new technology, persistence, and the power of genetics, a faint trace left behind by steady hands in 1996 had begun to speak again. What had once seemed impossible was suddenly within reach, a living suspect hidden in plain sight for over 25 years. Detective Jensen began piecing together the fragments of Matthew Cross's life, tracing his steps back to the years when Robin Lawrence was alive. He had been in his early 30s then, unmarried, moving from one short-term job to another, mostly as a handyman and carpenter. He was known among co-workers for being quiet and withdrawn, but there were hints of unsettling behavior and obsession with certain clients, uninvited visits to their homes, and sudden disappearances whenever people grew uncomfortable. Several neighbors from the old construction site recalled Cross lingering around the street where Robin lived, often parked in his old blue truck late into the night. No one had thought much of it at the time. He was just the local worker finishing projects in the area. As Jensen reviewed his background, she uncovered a pattern. Over the years, Cross had been reported for following women, leaving unwanted notes, and loitering near their homes. None of the complaints ever led to charges because he always moved before authorities could act. His record looked clean enough on paper, but beneath it was a trail of unease and fear. Jensen's instincts told her that Robin had been one of his early targets, someone he had admired from a distance until his obsession grew uncontrollable. Investigators compared his old job assignments with the timeline of Robin's life. It turned out Cross had done a small repair in her home, a broken window frame, just weeks before she was killed. That explained the lack of forced entry. Robin likely recognized him and allowed him inside without hesitation. Once inside, something must have triggered his violent impulse. Perhaps rejection, perhaps a confrontation. Whatever it was, he acted quickly and left nothing behind but a few overlooked traces that had waited decades to be discovered. To confirm the link, detectives conducted surveillance on Cross, now 61, living alone in a small, cluttered house outside of Fairfax. They collected his discarded coffee cup from a gas station trash bin and sent it to the lab for testing. Days later, The results came back an exact match to the DNA found on the adhesive tape from Robin's wrist. It was the moment that broke open a case frozen in time. The man who had lived freely for 25 years was finally exposed, his carefully buried secret pulled back into the light. When the arrest warrant was signed, a team of officers quietly surrounded Matthew Cross's small home at dawn. He stepped outside holding a mug of coffee, unaware that his freedom was about to end. The arrest was calm, almost eerie, as if he had been expecting it all along. Detectives searched the property and uncovered a disturbing collection of items: old newspaper clippings about unsolved crimes, faded photographs of houses around Fairfax, and a box of tools eerily similar to those listed in the original 1996 case file. Among them was a roll of the same kind of industrial tape found on Robin Lawrence's wrist. Every detail connected him back to that November night. Cross said little during questioning. He neither confessed nor denied his involvement, only staring at the table as evidence after evidence was laid before him. The DNA match was undeniable, the timeline exact, and his connection to Robin's neighborhood irrefutable. The prosecution built their case around forensic proof, behavioral patterns, and the reanalyzed physical evidence from the crime scene. What had once been fragments of suspicion now formed a solid chain linking him to the murder. For investigators who had inherited a hopeless file, it was a moment of long-awaited justice. The trial drew local attention as one of the most remarkable cold case breakthroughs in the region. Robin's family, who had spent decades living with uncertainty, finally faced the man accused of taking her life. The courtroom was silent as prosecutors described how Cross had entered her home under the guise of trust, how his obsession turned deadly, and how he meticulously staged the scene to hide his crime. When the verdict came, it was swift: guilty of first-degree murder. For Detective Jensen, closing the Lawrence case became a defining moment in her career. It showed that even the faintest trace of truth could outlast time. After the conviction, Robin's daughter, now an adult, visited the site of her childhood home. The neighborhood had changed, but the memory of that night still lingered in the air. Standing there, she finally felt a sense of peace. The silence that had once been filled with unanswered questions was now replaced with resolution. Robin Lawrence's story ended not in mystery, but in justice served, proving that even decades later, truth can still find its voice.